Can you hear me when I speak like this? This microphone works and the translator can hear. I came because I think the topic of this 3-day symposium is really interesting, and I didn't want to miss it. It is something I'm thinking about a lot, but I haven't really developed as much as some of you researchers who are dealing with the digital use of digital materials in your research. And it is certainly one of the challenges for any archive today is how to move from the old physical carriers to the digital domain, and also how to access and how to accept and also manage and find ways to keep available in an international forum the materials that are being developed by researchers today. I'm an anthropologist. I've worked mostly in research archives. Those are archives which hold research collections done by anthropologists or ethnomusicologists, and I'll be talking a bit about that later. So I'm not talking about commercial music. I'm not going to be talking about too much about national archives. The United States has one, but I'm not going to be talking about that. That's a different level of preoccupation, a different kind of accessioning also. I want to thank Gisela Canepa for a wonderful invitation to come down, and thank you all for staying to the very end of this very long set of days we've had here. And I apologize I couldn't make it to all of your papers, but I did hear a lot and I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to writing it down when I get home. My presentation overlaps a little, inevitably, with what some of you have already said. So those parts I'll skip over or make some comments very briefly. Other things are new. Let's see if that will go. I've made a fairly long PowerPoint because I didn't know that there was going to be simultaneous translation. Our emails stopped working with one another at that point. So listen to the translation is better because I'm saying things that are not on the PowerPoints. The PowerPoints were basically to help you sort of tell where I was and what I was talking about if there was no translation. So I'm going to start with a song. I think it's time to have a song. It's the end of the conference. And the song will come back, so I hope you'll learn it, the chorus. And then I'm going to address anthropology and audiovisual archives with a focus on research-based audio archives. And I'm going to talk about the demons attacking our oral and audiovisual heritage, actually, and the difficult choices we have ahead and the little time we have left to make those choices. I'm going to talk about legal and ethical challenges that we need to be considering as we're working. I didn't hear a lot about ethics or legal issues in this conference, and so I do want to bring that into the discussion. It does affect how we can acquire and how we can disseminate. And I'm going to be talking also about opportunities for democratizing access to and deposits into and documentation of collections. I think the digital opportunities are huge in this area. The amount of material is also huge, and that brings challenges. So the song. The chorus that you have to learn, I hope you'll learn because I don't have much of a voice today. I've got my throat's dry. The chorus is lost, lost forever, no more music and dance. No one can do them because no one has learned them, and so we have lost them for good. Yes, so we have lost them for good. Why don't you try that? Lost, lost forever, no more music and dance. Lost, lost forever, no more music. I must sing other songs besides this one in English. There have been so many popular songs in English. So try that again. Lost, lost forever, no more music and dance. No one can do them because no one has learned them. No one can do them because no one has learned them. And so we have lost them for good. Yes, and so we have lost them for good. Here's the melody, and then we'll try that. Lost, lost forever. No more music and dance. No one can do them because no one has learned them, and so we have lost them for good. Yes, and so we have lost them for good. If you can't get the whole chorus, at least get that repeated last time. Right? But try it. Lost, lost forever. No more music and dance. No one can do them because no one has learned them, and so we have lost them for good. Feel comfortable? I'll move on. Homo sapiens appeared a long time ago, and traveling the world we quickly did go. We talked and we sang and we danced as we went, but nothing remains, there were no archives then. Lost, lost forever, no more music and dance. No one can do them, there were no archives, and so we have lost them for good. Yes, so we have lost them for good. All right, try a little louder. Imagine you're in a soccer stadium instead of in a very tight. The acoustics here are not very good for singing together. One of the things that came up as we were talking on the first day was, what are we talking about when we're talking about an archive? And some of my confusion was because I was thinking in English, and in fact, Spanish uses the same word archive for a file folder, computer file folder, or a real one, the paper one, and a file cabinet, what the Americans call file cabinets, are archivadores. And then the audiovisual archives, or film archives, or paper archives, or photograph archives, they're called archives also in Spanish. And that's the only thing we really use archive for, collections of collections in English. So we were talking about, well, what is an archive? I think there's a big difference between a collection and an archive. A collection is a purposeful assemblage of material by a person or group, often in several media, usually about a given subject matter or research. My collection of Brazilian Indian music included many tapes, but also musical instruments and some non-musical related subjects. And so it had three-dimensional, two-dimensional, it had some video, some silent film. And so that together, it was a fairly coherent collection because it was all about the same group of people, done by the same person. And I started depositing my collections at Indiana University, Archives of Traditional Music, 6 months after I got out of the field in 1973. I couldn't wait to get it out of my house in case my house burned down. I hope you thought so too. An archive, by contrast, is a place that acquires collections as a whole. Archives usually keep the collections together, at least conceptually. So it's not a list of titles of all the Seeger music ever recorded by anybody. My collection is the things that I deposited. And that makes sense because my field notes, publications I've made, other things actually relate to those other parts of the archives. So it's important to think that collections are important and they're integral, and we heard a lot about a number of specific digital collections on the first day, what I would call collections. And archives would acquire those with great pleasure, as long as they were identified well, and then would have those along with other archives. And there might be 10 years later, another set of research documents related to one of those topics, and those would be comparable. And the advantage of having an archive that has a long-term vision of how long you keep things is that you can actually build on knowledge that was already done. You can see what has changed, how technology changed life, but also how medicines changed life, and how music was performed. And for all I know, the Seeger may all be playing heavy metal by the time in 10 years or something like that, which would be whatever they want. It's fine. Archives, I think I've described them as having four major functions. They have acquisition. They need to get things, otherwise what's the point? They need to organize the materials. They need to preserve the materials, and they need to disseminate them. And some archives are better at one and some are better at the other, but they really all need to work, because what's the point of preserving something if no one can ever use it? And what's the point of having an archive if all you have is old stuff and you're not getting any new collections? You're not building anything for the future use ahead. Now, in the past, the four functions have been housed in a single building. Indiana University, we have one building that had all of those things in it. And this is a picture of the Phonogram Archive in Berlin, of the building of it. No, it's not all the archive. And if you want, you can put it into building, but actually I think it's much more effective to separate these four, so that you can actually do your acquisitions in small villages and communities, and have the people who live there contribute what they think is important to contribute and preserve. I think the organization of collections and cataloging them in a way that can be found both locally and nationally and internationally is a separate piece of the job, and not something that people who aren't trained should be expected to try to do. Preservation requires, as we've heard in the last session, a lot of money for air conditioning, and also major investments in IT, in digital equipment, because you keep on having to update, you keep on having to have more than one copy around. That's probably not going to work as well in small towns and small villages as it would in a centralized archive facility that was housing many different collections from all over the country, perhaps, in one place, so that they could all be rotated and taken care of by a fairly small group of technicians. But back in the local areas is where you could have the dissemination, so that there could be local community archives everywhere. It could be small communities, large communities. They could disseminate in any way they thought fit. It could be through a radio program. It could be through access coming in and listening to it, but more likely access through cell phones or some other things. But I forget to turn this on. But you know how long I've been talking?
5 minutes.
I'll take 5 minutes. I had a note to myself to turn this thing on, but I forgot to read it. Now, archives don't acquire neutral objects. They aren't, what we have in archives are not sort of natural objects. They're cultural objects. They've been created by a number of different people and forces. Miguel Garcia has just published a nice article called Sound Archives Under Suspicion in a book on historical sources and ethnomusicology and contemporary debate. Miguel worked with the Phonogram Archive early collections of music in Argentina, and similarly to a couple of the papers that we heard here on the second day. Archive collections are shaped by who collects them, and there was a fair amount of racism and colonial perspective on what to record and how to position people in the late 19th, early 20th century. They also are shaped by what the performers' decisions were, what they decided to record. They're shaped by the technology available, cataloging decisions. The way an archives catalogs things can make some things invisible. And it's important to think about cataloging systems as you make collections and as you create archives. It's a lot better now because thanks to computers than it was when we had to type a separate paper card for each access point to a collection. Archive collections already begin with loss because whatever there was out there is only partially being acquired, and it's being acquired and changed by this whole process of archiving. Alexa Veloz referred to some of the critical literature on archives in her presentation. I recommend looking at that literature. I'm not going to talk about it here since she already presented some of it. I want to separate two kinds of audiovisual archiving, audiovisual materials. One is commercial recordings that were produced by companies in large numbers and sold. While important, there are often many copies available. Sometimes they're very rare. When one copy can't be played, another may be possible to find somewhere else. And then there are unique recordings, and this is the kind that we were talking about with the early cylinders. That it was possible to copy a cylinder, but actually the Phonogram Archive was the only place that had an easy way to copy these fieldwork cylinders. And the unique recordings, where there was only a single original, are among the most fragile and threatened anywhere, because if that goes, then there really is nothing left. And that's why I wanted to get my stuff into the archives in Indiana, because they gave me a free copy and to use for my own work. But I at least didn't have to spend my life at nights wondering, well, is my house burning down? It was their job to figure out if their archive was burning down. But since we've been talking about sound, I thought it's worth looking at the first known ethnographic recording ever made by an anthropologist. It was made in 13 March 1890 by Professor Jesse Walter Fuchs at Harvard University, and he was recording Passamaquoddy Indians in Maine as a test of the equipment he'd just gotten before he went out to the Southwest to make a lot of other recordings. He recorded on, you've seen photographs of these, you know how they work, thanks to other people's presentations. This is a group of Passamaquoddy, and this is the first, it was made on the first day. I'm not sure we really know which was the actual first one that was recorded on that day, but here it is. So, there are two things to note about that. First, it's kind of noisy. A lot of scratches on that, and that's the way those things sound. If you're doing transferring a lot of them, you go crazy with that sound. And the other thing was, at the beginning was an announcement. He announced who he was recording, where it was, and what the date was. I wish we still did that. It really helps to know that information, and of course it helped to then give it back to the Passamaquoddy, and they have been using it for inspiration and for knowing more about their past history and for continuing to practice a musical tradition that's gone on for hundreds of years. And we used to think that was extremely advanced technology. The early reviews of his recordings said, this is fantastic, it captures everything about music. And we think we've got it better now with high quality video, and digital audio, but I'm not sure we have. I think we may still be using primitive things. So here's another verse. I'm sorry I've changed the middle line in this case. Usually the middle line stays the same. So, remember the night when you danced all night long and the smell of the dawn as you walked home. Recall the crush of the crowd and the taste of the air. Your phone has a video, but none of that's there. Lost forever. No aromas, no taste, no crowd. We lose all those feelings when with media we're dealing. And now we have lost them for good now. And now we have lost them for good. That's pretty wimpy. And now we have lost them for good. Look at what we aren't capturing with our recording technology. We're missing the smells, we're missing the feeling, we can't record other people's emotion. I think people in 20 or 30 or maybe 50 years will look back at this as being one of the most primitive eras of recording technology they could imagine, which we left out so much of what life is all about. So as we're talking about loss and as we're talking about and thinking about what we can do with our devices, just remember, always think about what you're not getting and try to at least write that down. We are part of the problem, of course. Here's a verse about perhaps one of you digital researchers. There once was a collector who assembled digital files. When she was done, she left her media in a pile. Her computer was stolen, her house burned to the ground. Her ex-boyfriend was angry and took her cloud account down. They are lost forever. No more music and dance. No one can burn them. The collector abused them. Now we have lost them for good. Yes. Now we have lost them for good. Got it, thanks. It's coming around a few more times. I hope it won't get too boring. But the point of that one is that a lot of the loss actually in recordings happens not in an archive. It happens due to collector errors. And with digital files, it's so easy to push one button and erase things that it's very important to think about how to protect it. There are tens of thousands of hours of analog recordings on researchers' shelves, attics, or in their basements. I think the best time to start depositing your materials in an archive, if you can find one that's interested in collaborating with you, is as soon as you finish the project. Because then you know best what it is, and you can go right in and provide the cataloging material they need. It's much harder later, because you've done several other things in your lifetime. the very latest, though, it should be in your lifetime. You know more about the collection than anybody else. And the less is known about it, the less useful it's going to be for future generations of researchers, for community members, and for scholars elsewhere. The heirs are not necessarily good custodians of their parents' collections. What is happening with anthropologists' papers and recordings and photographs and films? Are these being archived in Peru? At the Smithsonian, there's an attempt to archive the field collections of the field notes of scholars, because people feel that those actually would be very useful to other scholars as well as communities or whatever. My field notes are really hard to read. I haven't quite decided. I started dictating them cleaning them up so I could understand them. And I got stuck, so I haven't decided what to do. Because the trouble with field notes is, at the beginning, you're making a lot of really stupid attempts to understand things. And then, when you've sort of gotten through the stupid stage, then you're trying to still work things out, but it's spread all over several hundred pages of notes. And then, when you write the book, you're usually at the top of your speed, at the top of your form, and you're putting it together. So I'm not sure I want to put all of my crude attempts to understand the Suya life and music into public domain, because it's so stupid and it won't help anybody at all. But those are issues you can work out with your own, perhaps separating your stupid part from Here's something else. Musicians, young children knew that their mom recorded some songs at one time for someone. So they Googled the scholar and spoke to her son, who said that he took all the tapes to the dump. They were lost forever. No more music and dance. No one can use them. The air has abused them. So we have lost them for good. Yes, so we have lost them for good. They're sounding better. I'm sounding worse. Let's see. You really have to watch out for heirs. They make decisions very quickly without asking anybody. Sometimes all they can think about is money, and and they also don't know enough about the collection to really be helpful in many cases. There are exceptions. Some heirs are exceptional themselves in what they know about that collection. But it's better to move on a collection if you think it's really important, while the person who made it is still alive. That's sort of silly. So here, I want to talk about two demons very briefly. They're demons. They're here, and there's not much we can do about them. Imagine your worst sci-fi film of destruction. All those American films, full of it. And that's what's happening. There's the demon of destruction and the demon of obsolescence. We've heard about these a little in other presentations, so I'm not going to do much more than refer to them and say something about them. The destruction comes from many sources. On the upper left is the burned out shell of the library of Sarajevo after the Serbs had attacked it and burned it, we shelled it and burned it in order to erase memory. And if you're going to do ethnic cleansing, and if you could prove that then there's no memory left of who actually was living in places and was there, it's much more efficient. So archives can actually be dangerous to themselves because of the information they have. An archive in Iraq was bombed by the Americans who were intending to bomb a radio station, but missed. They do a fair amount. The Nepali earthquake crushed collections and washed them away. I'm sure you can think of your own. If we have a tsunami that could wash a whole bunch away here. Some other things, bad things that happen is you can have a wax cylinder. This is apparently the first sound addition to a silent film that was ever recorded, and it's broken. You can fix those. LP records you can fix in 78. I didn't have a verse about that, but I'm not going to sing it. But this is digital audio tape. It seemed like a wonderful thing. It was a nice, high-quality digital format, and on a very small cassette, you could use it with batteries for a really long time. The trouble is, it doesn't last. It doesn't even last necessarily 15 years before you can't play it. In fact, if you try to play it on a recorder that you didn't record it on, you may not be able to play it the next week. It was a very, very unfortunate program. And so this is a very, very unfortunate format. it, like all the other formats, are decaying. This one is going bad faster. Reel-to-reel tape at 40 years. But bad things do happen to audiovisual documents. And so it's really good to think about, well, what can I do so that something bad doesn't happen to what I really care about, or what this nation really cares about. The demon of destruction, I talked about that already. Except that I should mention that digital data are also extremely subject to destruction. Recordable CDs and recordable DVDs are subject to self-destruction. Digital files can degrade, they can be hijacked. And with the expertise we seem to be making in cyber warfare around the world, I would be very worried about what you have in the cloud that's not backed up somewhere else. I don't know what's going to happen when people really get serious about blowing each other's cyber resources up. The demon of destruction is moving much faster than archivists are able to preserve our heritage. The International Association for Sound and Audiovisual Archives estimates we have between 10 and 20 years before we can't copy any more tapes. But the reason is not simply because of the tape disintegrating, which it does. The various layers basically attack each other and come apart at different speeds depending on which particular mix of chemicals was used in the tape. But the demon of obsolescence is what's really going to stop our ability to transfer tape. No company is making more tape recorders. Once all of the spare parts are used, there is going to be no way to copy tapes. And they think that's coming much faster than anybody suspects. And so if you have a little bit of extra money, go on eBay and start buying up the equipment that will play the recordings you either have yourself or in your archive, or in an archive if you're running an archive. I just bought 2 VHS recorders and playback machines on eBay that I'm going to carry to India in January because it's really hard to find even that very popular technology, VHS tapes. Find good players for it still because the heads tend to wear down. So obsolescence is a problem, and it's not only a problem with these physical formats. This was some friends of mine. Indiana folklorists work for 3 years to catalog their folklore on custom software. When they were done, how they celebrated. But later, the database could not be migrated. 3 years of work. Lost forever. No more music and dance. No one can use them because the programmers abuse them. So we have lost them for good. Raul Romero produced a wonderful, I think it was CD-ROM that you had produced here. But by the time it got to the United States, we'd shifted from DOS to Windows or something, and it was not possible to play back. I produced a number of enhanced CDs that don't play back. And that's only, 20 years ago that I was doing that. So even digital things are scary. You should be scared. The only way to battle the two demons is with careful strategy, careful digitization, regular and once something is digitized, not leave it somewhere digitized. It has to be migrated constantly because of these new platforms and the new software. You have a right, or you have to guess right about the technology. Manufacturers want low cost and big sales. They don't care if something's going to last for 10 years or 20 years. If that's not what they care about. They care about 2 years, and then they'll sell you a new machine that's better. That's where cell phones work. So you have to be careful what people tell you about something, because they're telling you about something that hasn't been designed for what most archivists need and for many researchers. And don't trust commercial companies with your data. It's when companies are expanding and are doing really well, they usually have money to store everything and keep it. But as the US record companies in various epochs, right, during the Depression and then more recently, and when they suddenly had to contract, they started throwing out what they had in their archive because it cost money, took up space. Columbia Records, which should have known better, threw out all of the metal parts for making LPs, which has the best possible sound on it. So everything they had left to make the LPs from was worse than those metal parts. There are a lot of other stories of people who worked for a company going out to a big dumpster, a big trash thing, and pulling out tapes and pulling out documents in order to keep them when the company had decided not to. So I think we have to be careful about trusting too much the goodwill of large companies when things go bad. Most music is owned or controlled by someone. Unless rights are granted, nothing can be done. There are problems of ethics and social justice too, and no one is certain what they should do. Lost, lost forever. No more music and dance. No one can do them because someone has claimed them, and so we have lost them for good. Yes, so we have lost them for good. Take some more air in. If we're down at sea level, you can expand your wings. Intellectual property issues are very important because they aren't just about what the copyright law is about, which is giving a limited term monopoly to a company and an author to make money on the product before it becomes available to everybody. It's much more complicated than that. And I've written a number of papers on it, been at a lot of conferences. I won't go into much here except for to raise my own experience, or actually an experience of a colleague, Marcela Coelho de Souza, a Brazilian anthropologist who works with the SUIA now. I'm going to pause for an advertisement. Just so you have an idea, I don't know if you can see the word Kinseji up there. It's kind of dark. Right under the word Brazil is pretty much where the Kinseji live. And that's an advertisement for sandals that were designed by Giselle and are sold under her name. Giselle München is a supermodel who appears in the thing. And the SUIA did this and in order to make quite a lot of money. The relationship was arranged through an NGO in Brazil, Socio-Ambiental, and they did a great job of negotiating a pretty good amount for the SUIA, a pretty good amount for Socio-Ambiental, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The problem was the SUIA had to figure out what designs they could license to her because most of their designs they actually learned from captives that they'd captured over the decades before they made peace. In fact, their whole history of the world is they began with nothing and they kept on taking it from other people and other things and other beings. They got fire from the jaguar, corn from the mouse, ceremonies from people who live under the ground, and a whole bunch of other ceremonies, and body paint from Indians that live just up the river. So they had to think, well, we don't want to give them any money. We don't want them to get the money. We wanted ours. And they really couldn't remember a female body painting style that they didn't know was somebody else's. So they had to spend a fair amount of time thinking about that. And they came up with one. And that's what they were painting her with. It's a style that is unlike anything I'd ever seen before, but that's because they were using other people's body paint styles. But the SUIA went further than that. They thought, oh, this is serious. We do all these things that we learned from other people. And so they stopped making certain artifacts. They stopped making baskets in the style of the Upper Shingo Indians because that's where they learned how to make baskets. They stopped selling pots because they captured the makers of pots from the Upper Shingo Indians, and so it also wasn't theirs. And then they began to purify their language. They started taking out all the foreign loanwords in their language. And so what starts as an interesting exposure and negotiation so the indigenous peoples actually make something from their ideas, it turned into a major change of the society itself because of that process. I think we need to be quite aware that intellectual property does more than just bring money to people. it can also change people's understandings of themselves and of the world. Many indigenous peoples around the world argue that they weren't part of the decision to make the copyright law the way it's made, which benefits urban people who create new works and sell them, as opposed to other people who may think that music has nothing to do with commerce. It has to do with the sacred, and they don't want anybody ever to be able to buy it. And they're having, and even more, they don't want anybody to be able to use it after copyright expires, because all copyright does expire. So there are serious issues of justice, social justice, and there are also serious issues of ethics for those of us who record them. In many parts of Pacific Islands, Australia, the relationships among many groups are in fact made through who is allowed to know something. You know when you're born, more or less, what kind of thing you're going to know because you're in a certain clan, but you only get to know it slowly as you get older and older, and it depends on your gender, which part of the community knowledge, the clan knowledge you learn. And I won't go into this further except to say that UNESCO and WIPO are both proposing actions to protect indigenous knowledge. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, approved on 13 September 2007, radically transforms the rights of indigenous peoples to commercialize and to control the use of their cultural heritage. I don't know if Peru is a signer. The United States is a signer, but as far as I know, no legislation has ever been written for it, except in Taiwan, which has probably the most forward-thinking and indigenous-friendly copyright law for indigenous peoples that I've ever seen. I saw it about 10 days ago when I was there. It allows collective ownership and collective composition, which our copyright law doesn't. It also allows ownership in perpetuity. It doesn't ever expire. So their songs, their sacred songs, or the songs that they identify as theirs, will never be usable by somebody else without paying. It doesn't enter what's called the public domain, the big ocean of freely available ideas. When you make recordings, if you're recording, and many of you are, because I know many have heard the papers, I guess the question is, what kinds of permission are you getting? For what? What use, and how clear are you being about it? In recent years, when I've been reporting, I usually ask, I don't usually give people a contract because, for one thing, they often don't read, and people don't, not everybody reads, and they certainly don't read necessarily in English. And I could write it in Portuguese, but that they still couldn't read it for a long time. So I would ask them, is it okay if I record this? And they would say, of course, yes, that's what you're here for. And I say, is it okay if I put it into an archive so that other people can listen to it? Okay. And then I say, is it okay if I make a recording of it, a commercial recording of it, as long as you get the money, and use it to raise money for you, but also use it to let more people know about your recording? Some people will say yes to that, and some people won't, but that is a critical question if you are going to put it on. Oh, you could also ask, can I put it on the internet if they know what that is? Because without passing permissions, you don't have them. And you can't pass the permission you don't have, to an archive to be allowed to archive or use them or disseminate them. So without permissions, it's really, really very hard. And you can say, well, we don't need permissions, it's the digital age. Yeah, but take that perspective from an indigenous person whose land has been stolen, whose ideas have repeatedly been taken and used to make profit for other people. Having that happen again, I think we should be beyond that stage of development. I was just at a conference in Shanghai last week on repatriation, which is returning old collections, returning older recordings to communities. And we had a whole paper on that. The whole Victoria's paper, I think, was entirely about that. So I'm not going to go into that, except for to say there are many ways that you can repatriate, and there are many things you can do. And you never know what the uses of recordings are going to be. Why return those old things? Well, actually, in Australia, the anthropologists' recordings of myths and songs were admitted to the High Court as evidence of their right to land, because they were so precise and it had passed on for so long, describing specific geographic markers where that group had arrived and stayed afterwards. They'd been singing to the English for a really long time without being understood. They were singing their rights to their land. And it was only with the action of a number of very active anthropologists and land claims cases that it was possible to really change, and that changed the importance of the archive. Suddenly the archive was a source for really serious things like land and survival. So you never know when you're archiving a collection exactly which parts are going to be important. The collections in South Africa, the African descended people in South Africa couldn't get into archives, they weren't allowed in the buildings, but also only through archival materials can they prove that they resided in certain places from which they've been cleared out during apartheid. The usefulness of archives can transcend the pretty music or the study of a single scholar. I'm not going to do any more about that. I won't tell you about that, though I will say that when I returned my recordings to the SUYA, they had asked for them. I was waiting until they asked. It seemed to me when they wanted it, that was the right time to give it to them. I sent it back. I didn't really think it through as well as I should. That's a different paper. But they are analyzing it, and there are some women transcribing the stories. And they also use the recordings I made in videos that they're doing, because I have the earliest recordings of the group. And there's some things they want to use my silent film for, and things like that. Steps to democratize archives. I really am getting toward the end, and I'm about to be at the end of the 35 minutes that was my prologue to the ending of this. One thing that you can do, that we can all do to democratize archives, to make more things into the archives and from local perspectives and collected by people who know what it is they're actually recording. That is to assure that acquisition is done in a way that allows individuals and communities to contribute to the archives. Oops, I thought I turned it off. Another thing you could do, and that's why I was saying you could take the acquisition part of the archive and send it all over the country, and people with bicycles or motor scooters or motorcycles. You can also organize the materials in a way that can be used locally and internationally. That requires thinking through not only authority files that exist, but also ways that you can double that authority file of a very technical term with a local term for the material. Then if you're really going to be good, you need to preserve the collections well enough so that they're available when they want them. And you need to, it's a good idea to not just take that permission once, but before you do something like make a CD, you go back and check and make sure it's still okay. We produced a number of albums on Folkways Recordings. I didn't. The person who ran it as a private company in New York. And the American Indians today are not, have asked to have a few of those taken down because the anthropologist who recorded it and put it up hadn't really asked them whether it was okay to have it on an LP. So we had, of course. And then I think another way to democratize access to archives is to ensure that the dissemination, the way that the materials that are in the archive are actually made available to people, is as broad and as accessible as possible. Some things you may need that the internet may not capture right, but there's a whole lot that the internet does. If you've got your rights in order, then you can start making it available. Audiovisual archives can't put anything commercial online if it's more recent than 1923 in the United States. And that's, there was some great music before 1923, but it's not necessarily what people who are making music they want to listen to or sample or work with. Field collections aren't necessarily copyrighted in that way, but there are issues then of rights and respect and of money. But so the more ways you can get the material out there and more ways you can help people find it, the better it's going to be for the archive, because you create a new partnership. This came up a number of times in the presentations. By working with the community or musicians, they can actually improve the documentation you have. They can give you translations for things that were badly translated. They can sing some more songs for you. In Rajasthan, the Archive and Research Center for Ethnomusicology in New Delhi has quite a few recordings from Rajasthan. And they've done a number of collaborative projects in which the people were so excited to hear the recordings, they came back and sat in the archive and sang more and went through the documentation, corrected what had been done. And then they continue to come to the archive, and they continue to donate to the archive. And that kind of new relationship that can be created if you can, in fact, start this reciprocal and collaborative process of giving things, returning things on the one hand, and also being open to new information about them on the other, will enrich what we know and will enrich what scholars in the future can work with and what people in Rajasthan can work with immensely. So those are one of the important aspects of this, is the aspect of the new relationships that digital access and dissemination can have. Digital technology offers great possibilities now, and I was listening hard to what you were saying, but some old problems just don't ever change. And one of those is ethics and rights. Money is still a problem for the archives as well as for the communities, and also the demons of destruction and obsolescence are running fast right now. The formats for video have changed so often in the last few years, and that it's really hard to keep enough machines around, and hard to be sure that with any certainty the machine you're using now will be able to find one to play what you recorded on it. I'm also picking up some high-8 recordings players. So, I think it's time to end this. So I hope you're all ready to sing one last chorus. It's a different chorus. At the end of this conference, we know what to do. If we work together collaboratively, we may see it through. Individuals, communities, and anthropologists may all see a gain. And at last we can sing a different refrain. Not lost forever. We'll still have music and dance. People can do them because someone has learned them. And we will all have them for a little while. Yes, and we will have them for a while. I can't tell with our